Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to be here. And the topic that we are here to discuss is, of course, In Search of Lakshmi. And the idea here is to think about how, through the long course of our history, how we as a civilization have thought about economic issues and how these economic issues can be applied to the problems that we have today. We have here, of course, as you know, both Hindol and Ruben. We were going to have a third panelist, Devdutt, but unfortunately he was called away for a medical emergency at home. So unfortunately he can't join us. But you may then have to put up with a lot more of my opinions than I would have liked to have imposed on you. Nevertheless, what I'll get going. Of course, as many of you may have read ad nauseum in various economics articles over the years, is that, of course, for much of history, human history, the Indian economy was one of the world's largest economies. In fact, according to estimates by Angus Maddison, which is widely quoted, till about 1000 AD, India's economy, and I'm not talking about a subcontinent, India as the landmass today, accounted for a third of the world's GDP. This was larger by a significant margin the contributions of the Roman Empire and, of course, the contributions of the Chinese. From around 11th century onwards, our share of GDP slowly began to come down. And about the 16th century, the Chinese bypassed us. But still, India continued to be the second largest economy in the world till well into the 19th century, from where our share of world GDP began to decline rapidly, partly because the European and then North America's shares began to rise rapidly as they industrialized. And of course, at the same time, we deindustrialized during the colonial period. So the first point is, of course, we were for a very long part, in fact, for the bulk of known human history, the driving force of world economy. But what did our ancestors think about economic issues? Surely they have left behind many interesting thoughts in various books, legends, and so on. And what can be discerned about what these ideas were? Now, the most obvious place to start a discussion about our economic thoughts is from this book, which many of you may have heard of, which is Kautilya's Arthashastra. It was written in the 4th century BC by a professor of economics called Chanakya, or Kautilya, also known as Kautilya, who went on to then set up one of the great empires of the world, the Mauryan Empire. He's very often dismissed as India's Machiavelli, but in fact it's a bit unfair, partly because, you know, Machiavelli was a small-time political commentator in northern Italy. He was not really of great consequence even in his own lifetime. Whereas Kautilya was a serious guy. I mean, he set up, as I said, India's first great empire and served as its prime minister. Not only that, the Kautilya's Arthashastra is a full manual. It's not just about doing Machiavellian things like setting up spy systems. It's also about taxation, it's about property rights, and all kinds of other things, including municipal laws, how to set up urban design, and so on and so forth. So what is the driving principles that you can discern from the Arthashastra? Now, one of the interesting things that comes across very clearly from the Arthashastra is that what Kautilya really is arguing for is a strong but limited state. The Kautilyan state does the following things. It basically does external security or defense, internal security, basic infrastructure like highways and so on. It does some welfareist things like during emergencies and accidents, the state does intervene to provide rescue work. But generally speaking, it is not a welfareist state at all. It is, as I mentioned, a strong but limited state. Very, very different from the state we have built since 1947, which is a weak but all-pervasive state. Kautilya would have been shocked by the Nehruvian construct. And this comes through in many, many different ways in the Kautilyan construct. In fact, the key thing that the state does, interestingly, is law and order and the administration of justice. Therefore, getting the legal system to work and the state having full monopoly over violence is a very critical part of what Kautilya's Arthashastra is about. And in fact, why so? Because the driving force of the Arthashastra is the avoidance of Matsya Nyaya. What is Matsya Nyaya? The law of the fish, where the big fish eat the small fish. So when Kautilya talks about property rights, he talks about enforcement of contracts and so on, what is he trying to do? He's trying to avoid Matsya Nyaya. And that, in his view, is the critical thing that leads to the welfare of people. Not welfarist policies, but the maintenance of law and order, enforcement of contracts, and so on. Now, this idea of Matsya Nyaya and the role that these, the enforcement of contracts and law is a very important thing that is there throughout much of early literature, and there's a lot of debate about it. So, for example, the Ramayana can be thought about as an epic driven by the need to enforce contract. Ram has entered into an agreement that he will go for these 14 years in exile. His father is now dies. It's patently obvious to everybody that's an unfair thing for him to do, but he honors that contract. He then does the same thing. The law says that you have to send away the queen, send away your wife, even if she is the queen. As the king, he's not above the law. He has to follow that law. Even though he's very sad about doing this, he follows that law. At great personal cost, he ensures that he follows the law. So this is part of that. And then you can see the backlash to this idea as well. So by the time the Mahabharata comes through, you also have the internal debate on this issue, that if you follow the law blindly, it doesn't always lead to great outcomes. So therefore you have Krishna, who is, by the way, the avatar of the same God, but then Krishna is willing to interpret the law in different ways. He is willing to twist the law at some points. So the thing is, you can see how in ancient times these debates were happening. Many of these debates were, as I said, the focus of it was Matsya Nyaya and how to avoid the strong from eating up the weak. The king is continuously warned in the Arthashastra not to be disciplined, and that the key dharma of the king is not to consume his subjects. So this is a very important part of the whole construct, so to speak. Now that is as far as the theory of Indic economic thought is concerned. Let me now turn to Rubin and ask him what he thinks about the real practice of economics in ancient India.
Sure. Thanks, Sanjeev, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. So let me start with a personal story. So my name is Reuben Abraham. I'm a Christian from Kerala. No big deal. I've never thought twice about it until I moved to the US. And I still remember the look on the immigration officer's face when they looked at my passport and they'll see my name and they look up at me and I could see the confusion on their faces. A person called Reuben Abraham with an Indian passport. They just could not figure it out. So they kept asking me, how did you end up with a Jewish name? And so on and so forth. Now, by the way, at that point in time, which is close to 20 years ago, I had no idea either. But that's what sort of got me to dig into the history of it. And the history of it is actually fairly obvious, which is that St. Thomas, the apostle, the doubting Thomas, lands on the coast of Kerala in Muziris in 52 AD. And what happens in 52 AD is that the New Testament, the Gospels, have not yet been written. So therefore, all the names have to, by definition, be taken from the Old Testament. So therefore, most Syrian Christians end up with Jewish-sounding names. So that's one part of it. Now, if you dig further into it, you'll ask yourself, why did St. Thomas come there and not other places, for instance? And what you realize, and more history is sort of revealing itself now, it appears now that sailors from the court of King Solomon used to visit ports on the west coast of India. Now, the more obvious records are the ones dating from about 580 BC onwards, which is when the first sack of the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem happens when Nebuchadnezzar destroys it, and the first wave of Jews basically come to Kerala. Equally fascinating, if I asked people in the audience about the Jumman Perumal Mosque, most of you have never heard of it. I would, in fact, even hazard that almost all of you haven't heard of it. Now, okay, there's a few hands that I see that are going up. Now, the Jumman Perumal Mosque, for those of you who don't know about it, was actually built in 628 AD, i.e. it was built when the Prophet was alive. Now, depending on how you look at the numbers, you can basically make the claim either that it's the second oldest mosque in the world, or it is definitely amongst the 5 oldest mosques in the world. It's sitting in India. Now, again, going back to St. Thomas for a second, you'll basically see that the first church in a place called Palayur, or a place called Niranam, was built in 52 AD. Now, the research on this is not very clear, but it seems, prima facie, because we haven't actually done enough research on it, it seems like this may well be the oldest extant church in the world. This is our civilizational history. Now, the question is, why did all of them come to India? And the answer is quite simply trade. Trade and globalization, and it speaks to how globalized India was at that point of time. So if you go back to, say, 2,500 BC, and all these excavations that have happened in Mesopotamia and so on, you'll basically see evidence of a flourishing trade between the Indus Valley civilization and Mesopotamia. The port of Lothal in Gujarat actually has perhaps the world's oldest lock, because ships could safely come in there, and so on. So what basically happens is Hippalus, who's an Egyptian mariner, in around 50 BC discovers the monsoons. He didn't obviously call it the monsoons, it was basically the trade winds. And the monsoons basically created a way to get from the Middle East to the Indian subcontinent very quickly. It was about 12 days is what it took. Now, what happens as a consequence of the monsoons being discovered is trade goes up dramatically. And the most obvious place where trade goes up is with the Roman Empire. So where the Romans, approximately, if I look at the numbers here, Rome and India used to have trade before the monsoons. It used to be about 20 ships a year used to visit. But after Hippalus discovers the monsoons, about a ship visits every single day. That was the extent of trade between India and Rome. Now, this leads to some very fascinating consequences, Sanjeev, which is that most of what we export are basically spices, fine textiles, and so on, and precious gemstones. And what we basically take back, because we actually don't see any value in what the Romans are exporting, what we take from the Romans is basically gold and silver, but mostly gold. And this then leads to something really fascinating, because you can read this when you read Pliny the Elder. He keeps talking about how the Roman treasury is being emptied by trade with India. The trade balance is so skewed in favor of India that the Romans begin to seriously worry about it. And so then, under Emperor Nero, they institute something fascinating. They reduce the amount of gold in the gold, i.e., in the gold coins, thereby the first instance of actually debasing the currency. They've actually debased the currency. Now, what happens later under Emperor Vespasian is that they actually stop the trade. They basically ban the export of gold because it was draining the Roman treasury. And that is the first time India begins to take Southeast Asia more seriously, and trade begins to build up on the eastern corridor. So in effect, as the Burmese historian Tan Mint Yu says, that was our original Look East policy, when Roman trade with India ended. So I can go on and on. I mean, so the Padmanabha Swami temple, when the treasury was opened, most of the headlines was about the amount of money that was lying in there, $20 billion, whatever. But if you actually look at what they discovered was obviously Roman coins, Greek coins, Venetian ducats, Portuguese, Dutch, and French coins. That's what's actually sitting in the vault of the temple. Okay? So, and then you have, and I can go into this at some detail if you'd like, but the Cholas go east, etc., etc. And the colonial project. We can come back to all of this. There's also some sort of slightly more modern history to this. But what am I trying to drive at here? I'm trying to basically dispute with two narratives. The first narrative, which is widely prevalent in India, that trade, globalization, all of these are somehow things that we have imported from the West, and these are things that have been used to subjugate us. The second narrative, which is widespread when you read a book like The World is Flat by Tom Friedman, is this notion that globalization began with Christopher Columbus. Both of which are not true, as I've clearly laid out for you now. And if you want to think about Western imports, the only Western imports in the economic realm are socialism, Marxism, and autarky. This is not our history. Our history is open trade, globalization, and capitalism. And I want to drive home that point using our civilizational history. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. I think that's superb. I'm going to, we have heard enough about ancient history, whether it's theory or the practice of it. So I'm going to move to a somewhat younger person to talk about more recent history. Over the last, of course, we are a living civilization. Many new things are continuously happening in it. And then over the last 100 years or more or so, our own economic thoughts have developed in various ways. So let me pass it on to Hindol. Maybe he can give us some flavor of the way our own thoughts and ideas have evolved in more recent times.
Yes, I think it would be wise to move from the experiences of, one part of India which has had the blessing of communism to another part of India which has had the blessing of communism, because I come from a wonderful place called Kolkata. So
communism creates the best capitalists.
That's right. It is the history of communism that it has always created the best capitalists. But before I come to even Kolkata, let's turn to a little bit of our sort of slightly older history. Let's go to the 1600s for just a moment. And since we're talking about Lakshmi, we should begin with Gujarat and the Gujaratis, right? Now, one of the myths that I grew up in Kolkata was that dhanda and the godi is a bad thing. You must never aspire for dhanda and the godi, because that is something that the Marwadis did. Because we, the Bhadraloks, were, built not to look at such dirty things, right? And the sort of affectation of that statement was that in somehow we were more moral, we were more pure, we were more uncorrupted and unsullied by money, because somehow money sullies everything, right? And we never understood how glorious this sullification was, because we never had any, right? So it continued to sort of continuously make us uncorrupted, geniuses, so to speak. But the Gujaratis, even then, even in 1600s, knew that money was a purifying thing. Let me tell you how. Let me go to a story of a man I discovered when I was writing my last book, Recasting India, called Bhimji Parekh. I accidentally came upon this character called Bhimji Parekh. I wasn't looking for him. Bhimji Parekh is a very interesting character. Bhimji Parekh in the 1600s is one of the great businessmen of Surat. Right? He dominates trade with his Gujarati brethren in Surat. Right? And they are a group of people who contribute huge amounts of money to the treasury of the Emperor Aurangzeb in those days. Right? But in the 1600s, Bhimji Parekh and his brethren have a problem, because the henchmen of Aurangzeb are destroying, or have begun destroying, temples in Surat and attacking viciously the Surat Gujaratis, right? So what is a Gujarati to do in such a circumstances? So he does what a Gujarati usually does when they are faced with trouble. He snaps the cord of money transfer. How does he do it? Classically, he does it with a man called Gerald Ongier, who was at that time the British resident in that area. So this is a classic, Indian history is so full of this. So Bhimji Parekh goes to this Englishman and says, look, boss, we can't give you a cent of money, and your cut will also not come if this continues. The Gerald Ongier at that time, has not much to do apart from convey this message to the emperor that this cannot go on, otherwise the Surat merchants will not give us the money. Right? Naturally, as it so happens, the emperor doesn't care, is busy with other things. And then it comes to a point where the emperor finally says, after much haranguing, fine, I'll give you a letter saying, in the future, you will not be attacked. So some letter arrives from the Darbar saying, you will not be attacked, don't worry, you continue to give us the money. But Bhimji Parekh is a clever man, right? He says, ye dekho boss, ye letter se kuch nahi hoga. You give us the actual people who will defend our temples. Otherwise, we cannot transfer the money to you. That obviously does not happen. And then, ironically, since we're talking about communism also, the first strike ever led in India happens under Bhimji Parekh. What does he do? He takes this bunch of Surat, I would say at that time, very wealthy traders and merchants from Surat, who all en masse moved to Bombay, saying that we are not going to be part of this system, we will not give any money. So this bunch of Surat traders move from Surat and go to Bombay, leading the first ever, and may I say this with great pride, non-violent strike in India, far before Gandhiji arrived in the picture. So this non-violent strike is led, and they move to Bombay. Finally, after many weeks of them moving to Bombay and cutting off all supplies of money to the emperor has to bend and assures and sends men to defend Hindu religious places in Surat so that the merchants can go back to Surat and do their business. So I think this classic history, I mean, when I was writing the book, I told a friend of mine in Calcutta, even the strike was brought to us by the capitalists. The communists didn't even bring the strike to us. What are you talking about? Even the great measure of strike was a capitalist thing that a Gujarati brought. Neither the Bengalis nor the Malayalis can claim it. Even that was given to us by a Gujarati capitalist. So let's come a little further into our history and come to the great state of Bengal, which I had the privilege of growing up in. My Vijay Prasad once told me on Twitter that he, clearly from far away from India as always, saw growing up in Bengal as the fragrant mists that of progressive communism that enlightened every bone and every sinew. I unfortunately did not see it quite like that, since my father was almost attacked and killed by the communist cadre of the CPM in Kolkata for not being able to give something for the Bengalis here, something called chada, which is the sort of weekly hafta that you had to pay for the privilege of breathing the progressive air of Calcutta. But let's come to history in Bengal, to a man called Dwarkanath Tagore. So I went to Kolkata to give a lecture and essentially said, much to the anger of many people there, that the Bengalis had the misfortune of remembering and forgetting the right Tagore. We remember the right Tagore and we have forgotten the right Tagore. So we remember Rabindranath, a great man, and obviously Gurudev, but we forgot the wrong Tagore. We forgot Dwarkanath Tagore, who almost brought the blessings of the Industrial Revolution onto the shores of the Hooghly. Right? And I know, I see every time I mention Dwarkanath Tagore on Twitter, somebody or the other pops up and says, oh, that opium trader. And I see a lot of that. Be that as it may. But the larger point that I want to make is that even Dwarkanath Tagore, and if you look at that group of people around Dwarkanath Tagore, who at that time were working in Bengal, that Dwarkanath Tagore was a great capitalist and did great things and almost brought the Industrial Revolution to Bengal is a different story. But this idea that we were again brought up on, that business has no social role to play. Business only extracts profit and disappears. Business is inherently mercenary. All these theories I inherently disagree with, even as a Bengali. Even though I grew up only hearing how the Marwadis were squeezing our blood. I disagree with, because if you look at even Bengali history, some of the most powerful social reform movements were driven by people who were inherently capitalists, who believed that trade and mercantile activity would bring us success. And it was not just the money. They were willing to put their money to push extremely powerful social reforms. So that, the Sati story is well known. This is an audience that does not need to be reminded of the Sati story. But there's another story about Dwarkanath Tagore, less known, about this wonderful incident. Dwarkanath Tagore, as perhaps some of you would know, was multilingual, knew many languages, could speak them proficiently, write them beautifully, and so on and so forth. And it seems that, that there was this point where Dwarkanath Tagore is, standing in a road where the local British chieftain passes by, the administrator who everybody has to bow to. And as that carriage passes by, everybody salams to the white man, right? Dwarkanath Tagore does not, and is abused by the people there to on why he did not bow to the Englishman. And he writes this beautiful letter complaining that why should somebody like him have to bow? And I think that letter, in some senses, is very heartwarming in many ways for me, because it shows, even in a small incident, how the power of English language education, which many people despise in India, and the power of capitalism both come together wonderfully for social change. And I think these are lessons we need to revisit in our own history and understand and remember.
Yes, in fact, so was Raja Ram Mohan Roy. Yes. People do not forget that Raja Ram Mohan Roy started many of the great reforms in Hinduism, including, of course, getting rid of sati and so on. But of course, he was a banker, and a very powerful banker. And one of the reasons he was able to push through many of these things was that both the Indian sort of elite of Calcutta of that time and the British elite of Calcutta at that time were both indebted to him. And consequently, he was able to use that to push through many of the reforms, which at that time was quite remarkable, because neither the British nor the Indians were wildly keen on some of his reforms. Now, since you mentioned about the destruction of temples and so on a little earlier, I'm going to actually talk a little bit about why temples were such an important thing in Indian history. Many of the thoughts are, of course, about it was religious centers, there were art and culture and so on. But few people realize that one of the reasons that Indian temples were so rich was not that they were getting royal grants. Of course, many of the larger temples did get major grants. But because the temples were actually engaged in banking and venture capital. So many of the great temples, particularly of southern India, along the coast particularly, became rich because they were the financiers of the trade. That's why there was such a lot of gold there, because they were financing a lot of this trade. They were financing trade. They are, in fact, copper plates in Tamil Nadu which show how they were financing even municipal corporations, municipal bonds of various kinds. Many major infrastructure buildings in many parts of southern India were built with these sometimes grants, but very often loans. And the records of the northern temples are not there because they were much more thoroughly destroyed. But nevertheless, it is not unreasonable to believe that that was what they were doing as well. And in fact, one of the things that happens after the 11th, 12th century, when the Turks carry out these major destruction of temples, is that Indian maritime expansion suddenly comes to a grand halt. Now, it is very often blamed on caste and other kind of things, and it's possible that there were such things. But you see, it's very difficult to justify them using caste as being the reason, because caste had existed before the 12th century, but Brahmins, non-Brahmins, Kshatriyas, everybody seemed to be crossing the seas without any trouble. And in fact, everybody benefited from it. The artisan classes were benefiting from their products going abroad. The kings were getting revenue from it. Of course, the merchants were doing these great voyages to Southeast Asia and to the Middle East. And of course, the Brahmins were a great beneficiary of this because they were in huge demand in the courts of Southeast Asia. So many of them were going back and forth. And not many people realize that, in fact, some of the great kings of southern India are not Indian at all. Nandi Varman II, who built some of the great temples of the Pallava dynasty, was very likely Cambodian. So there was a lot of interaction going on between India and, of course, on the west, but even in some ways much more so with Southeast Asia, going all the way through to China. In fact, temples of the 8th to 10th century have been found along the Chinese, many of the coastal towns of China. So there was a huge amount of trade going on, which was the basis of both, of course, spreading of Indian culture to Southeast Asia, but of course the wealth of the temples back at home. But it's not just the temples, but there were much more elaborate mechanisms. For example, corporatized guilds, which basically functioned like multinational companies. So there was the guild of corporatized guild called the 500, which existed for hundreds of years, from the end of the Pallava rule through the Cholas till the end to the end of the Chola rule. So hundreds of years, we have lots of documents showing how they took loans and enter contracts. They enter contracts into artisan guilds who were providing with the cloth and other things that they were taking out. We even have an inscriptions in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, for example, of showing how they hired mercenaries for protecting their commercial interests. So they were, in some ways, functioning almost like the East India Company, completely armed multinational companies functioning in over large periods of time and space. So these are some of the things that have existed for long periods of time in India. So the things are not new. But one of the things that comes out of the Arthashastra is that in this environment of trade externally, even internally, huge amount of finance changing hands, and so on, what was the governing principles by which the rulers were supposed to rule? If you were dealing with this massive economic machine as the state, what was the role of the state in all of this? And it's quite interesting. The role of the state in all of this, as I pointed out, one of them was, of course, to provide law and order, enforcement of contracts and so on, which I spoke about earlier. But there is in the Arthashastra a very interesting note about governance, which is the following, that the key people who need to be distrusted in this entire system are the government officials. Now this is important because you see, how do we run governance systems today? The basis of governance is that the taxpayer, the businessman, etc., is corrupt. He's got black money. Therefore, the way to carry out a tax system is in fact to ask them to give them all kinds of pieces of paper, Form 16A, Form 53B, all kinds of things. Why did you spend this much money and so on your Amex card? All these kinds of things are expected to be answered to the tax officials. Whereas that is exactly the opposite of what Kautilya would have said. Kautilya said that it is not the people, but the officials the first principle is that you should assume that they are corrupt. In fact, he says that government officials finding out whether or not they are stealing money is as difficult as telling whether a fish in water is drinking water. So what is the meaning of this? That when you create a tax system or any rules and regulations, they must be very, very simple. And they should be as little discretion and allowed to the official, because if you allow him any discretion, he's guaranteed, in the Kautilyan view, he's guaranteed to misuse it. So it is a very different basis on which governance was carried out. Now, I wonder why, Ruben, you think that this sort of principle actually has turned on its head and we've ended up with what we have today.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Before that, let me just go back to trade for a second. And there's one thing that is worth mentioning, which is it's not as if to say that we were just benefiting all kinds of civilizations. We benefited enormously as well. So the single biggest example that you can point to is food. So think of Indian food 600 years ago. You don't have the tomato, you don't have the potato, you don't have onions, you don't have chilies. A whole range of these things don't exist. All of them come through our contact with trade networks.
Batata vada is impossible in this world.
Batata vadas would not be possible without the advent of trade and over a 600-year period. In response to your question, I mean, it's fascinating. So if you look at the administrative system, I think we've fundamentally inherited the British administrative system, right? And the British administrative system was built on the premise that all white people trust each other, but we don't trust the other. The brown person is not to be trusted. That's the underlying principle of the system. And we've sort of inherited it. So when you have mistrust as the basis of a system, and mistrust between the ruled and the ruler, in between the rulers, I mean, so one department not trusting the other department, and then complete mistrust in the government brand from the citizenry. It's almost like, so when you think of a lot of things where the government has done it right, and yet runs into a major controversy, is because this starting assumption on the part of the citizenry is the government's done it, I don't trust it. Okay? So there's a range of these things that have sort of played out. But I think to go back to Kautilya's view, I think it is so important to think of first principles. And I think you've already laid it out, simplicity and discretion. I mean, if you look at our constitution alone, and especially the amendments that have been made, the number of ifs and buts and but ifs and so on, that is not a way to write the rules. The rules have to be very clear and very simple and not open to interpretation and therefore exploitation by the ruler. I think it's damn important to drive these points home. So in many ways for me, Kautilya is actually a very useful first principle book at the Arthashastra to actually start from. I mean, the tax rate. He's actually talked about the tax rate and what is an optimal tax rate for the citizens. And he justifies why that particular tax rate is actually a good tax rate, and so on and so forth.
The Ramayana also, I believe,
Exactly.
in the morning I was having a discussion with him, and he told me that, in fact, the Ramayana says that the king is only allowed to take a sixth of the produce of the thing. So it's a
It was always either a sixth or a fifth of the producers.
Yes,
And
and
that's,
you have
that's a very big difference. I mean, we fail to recognize how big a difference that is. Because in the Indian tradition, unlike in many other parts of the world, the king does not own everything he surveys.
Absolutely.
The king does not own the people, the land, the trees, the birds, everything. In many other traditions, the king's, whatever the king's eye falls on, the king is the owner of. In the Indian tradition, the king isn't an owner. The king has clear duties and responsibilities. If fulfilled correctly and according to dharma, then the king deserves a particular share of the wealth that is generated. So it's a very clear, there's a relationship. The king has to protect, preserve the dharma and protect his citizens and so on and so forth. And if that is not done, then the king doesn't deserve to be king.
Yeah, if he cannot stop Matsya Nyaya,
Yeah.
then he does. The only reason he is allowed this share is because it is he who avoids Matsya Nyaya. If he, for example, is unable to do that, he should be removed. So, with that, let me pass it on to you for a further discussion. Now, what do you think about how you take some of these great principles and you apply them to a much more modern context, and particularly, I think, in the context of social change and urbanization and mobility in modern day India?
So Matsya, which we were discussing so many times, the big fish eating the small fish, so to speak. Let me begin with a wonderful story Chandrabhan Prasad once told me, and I think really his research in Uttar Pradesh on how free markets and liberalization impacted the Dalit community in Uttar Pradesh is fascinating. It's worth reading. So Chandrabhan Prasad tells me this wonderful story. He comes from Azamgarh, right? And he says he's in Azamgarh and he's talking to a Bhumiyar landlord who's extremely unhappy. And Chandrabhan Prasad asked him, but why are you unhappy? I mean, you have land and people working for you and you have money and so on and so forth. He said, नहीं, बड़ा खराब दिन है. खराब दिन क्यों है? और अच्छे दिन कैसे आएंगे? So he said, the problem ये है कि देखो पहले क्या होता था, हमारे खेतों में जो काम करता था आदमी, उसके घर में inevitably an agricultural laborer who was inevitably Dalit. जो काम करता था वो जो खेतों में जब काम करता था उसके घर में कोई त्योहार होता था वो हमारे पास आके बोलता था साहिब एक मुर्गी दे दो आज घर में कोई त्योहार है there's a function at home we want to cook a chicken please give us a chicken तो हम क्या करते थे एक मुर्गी उठा के उसको दे देते it would always be the scraggliest beast that you could find would be given to the agricultural laborer right आज क्या हुआ है समय बदल गया है 20 years of liberalization have gone by inevitably many of those families have sent young people into the cities to work so the Bhumiyar leader says कि वो हमारे सामने से मोटर बाइक में मुर्गी का गर्दन पकड़ के फरफराता हुआ चला जाता है it's a dagger in the heart of him you know that this has changed and it's transformative I mean if you look at research after research things that have changed because of the opening of the markets right do you know for instance in Uttar Pradesh the use of chairs increased among the Dalit community why chairs now you would ask why chairs what's the big deal about chairs right because in those communities there was a literal uchi jaat and neech jaat that inevitably the upper caste would sit on top and the lower caste would sit below. So the act of purchase of a chair is social mobility. It's very difficult for any of us perhaps in this room to understand this. Another fantastic story which I heard during the research of my book was this idea of what happens when young Dalit men or women or lower caste men or women come to a city and get a job as a pizza delivery person. What happens, when they get such a job? That they go, perhaps, and imagine for a second with me, they get into a little, scooter or motorbike, go up a building, and and hand over a box of pizza to somebody who doesn't even look at them, is probably on the phone, pays the money, takes the box, shuts the door. But Chandrabhan Prasad says, in that moment, Ambedkar and Adam Smith come together in a magical sort of way. Why? Because that boy or girl has perhaps never seen that somebody could accept food from their hand and not think for a moment. It's an unthinkable idea. And which is why, interestingly, his research also shows that when we were talking about, foreign direct investment in agriculture, one of the biggest people or one of the biggest communities who supported this was the Dalit community. Because it would break a lot of old agrarian hegemonies of caste. Right? And we fail to, traditionally, because of the dominance of the left in our discourse, we never hear these stories. These stories are entirely absent from our narrative. But this is how India is changing every single day. India is not changing, I don't want to mention JNU here, but it's certainly not changing via JNU. It is changing via these little millions of little ways India is changing every day. And I think we must celebrate this change. I think it is incumbent upon each of us to celebrate this change. And I believe in the free markets, and I proudly believe in the free markets, because I see this change happening every day. And if you'll allow me 10 seconds, there are many writers sitting around us, and both of us are also writers. Even 10, 15 years ago in India, you couldn't get a book published in the English language unless your dad knew David Davidar, your grandfather had played golf with Khushwant Singh. All of you were members of the Delhi Golf Club and the Delhi Gymkhana Club. Come on, we have lived with this in our country. I've seen this in my own lifetime. That today we have so many more voices writing in the English language is change.
Absolutely. That's a fabulous, thanks. I couldn't agree with more. The question now is, how did we end up with this welfareist discourse at all? Because you see, whether it is Kautilya or Ambedkar, they are clearly arguing in one, they are the great philosophers of India. And yet, we have ended up with exactly the opposite. How? And it is quite fascinating to look at how this narrative was built by thinking about the resurrection of Ashoka as a great king. Now, this is very interesting. You see, if you look at everything known about Ashoka, it is negative. He came to the throne, he was a usurper. He came to the throne by essentially killing all his brothers. Having done so, he carried out an absolute reign of terror. He then invaded and carried out genocide in Odisha by his own admission. Now, at this point, the common historian narrative is that he suddenly converted to Buddhism and became a pacifist. Now, the problem is this narrative is that it's a complete lie. He was already a Buddhist when he invaded, for at least 2 or 3 years before he invaded Kalinga. And he was a Buddhist largely because as I will explain, he had a problem with the rest of his family who had sympathies with another rival group called the Ajivikas. Anyway, he invades Kalinga, carries out his genocide. But in none of his edicts in Odisha does he mention his regret about it. This idea of his regret is written in edicts that are currently in Pakistan. Now, if he was really so regretful, the one thing you would want to do, you would think, was to at least apologize to the people he had carried out genocide on. In fact, even in the edict where he mentions that he feels regret for attacking Kalinga, he mentions clearly in the next very line that doesn't, just because I feel this regret, do not any of you dare to rebel because I will carry out on you exactly the same thing. He says it in the same edict. Please read it. It's there online, everywhere. Then after that, even better, is that even despite this so-called regret, he then later on carries out many massacres of Jains and Ajivikas in Bengal, which are clearly mentioned in the Ashoka Vadana. Now, the point is, whenever this is pointed out to some of these mainstream historians, they said, but this bit about him later on carrying out these massacres, they were inserted by Buddhist fundamentalists later. I said, maybe the case, then how do we know whether the rest of the things about him being a good king are also not being inserted by some fundamentalist? If you must apply the same lens to the text of the Ashoka Vadana, how do you know which one is true and which is not true? Maybe all of it is untrue. The only thing we know for sure is that before he died, there was a serious fiscal crisis in the Mauryan Empire, and the empire began to collapse while he was alive. And this is there in all the sources. So if he was such a great king, why did the Mauryan Empire collapse while Ashoka was collapsing? So this is the interesting thing here, is because in the Indian tradition, he's actually not considered a great king. He was in fact forgotten. He was rediscovered by the British in the 19th century when they began to decipher Brahmi scripts. And of course, when they read some of his inscriptions, they got very impressed because, of course, Ashoka wrote it for himself. It was basically propaganda. Everything else we know about him, unfortunately, doesn't add up to being a great king. But it is not even the British who elevated him to being Ashoka the Great. His elevation to becoming Ashoka the Great, interestingly, is an early 20th century adventure of the rising socialists of that time, including Nehru, who elevated him to be a great king because they were trying to create a political lineage for their own interventionism. And when they were looking for this lineage for their own interventionist policies, they very quickly found exactly what I did in the Arthashastra. It just didn't lend itself to creating an interventionist state. So they then came up with Ashoka and found that he had all very interventionist ideas about the world. He was going out and creating dharma mahamantas who went around trying to impose food habits on the rest of the country. Incidentally, since we talk about food habits, Ashoka was the first person to be interfering with everybody's food habits. And he put together these huge numbers of dharma mahamantas. Now, what are dharma mahamantas in modern terms? Religious police. So he, far from being a great king, was essentially a guy who destroyed the Mauryan Empire by introducing a religious police, by essentially having all these interventionist policies, and he then comes up with literally mentions that the king is the mother and father, Mai Baap, of the people. So the origin of the Mai Baap Sarkar is Ashoka. And then, after independence, he's of course elevated up the ranks to all these welfarist ideas, and all his misdeeds are cleverly left out of the history. Now, if you are Odia and you hear about how great the Ashoka was, it's like telling the Jews how great Hitler was. One of the reasons I wanted Devdutt here was so that I was hoping he would come up with a good rant about this. But anyway, moving on to that, I'd like to ask Ruben, what do you think? Do you think this conversation is finally being won?
Well, I think that is a simple answer, not yet. But I think we obviously need to make the point a lot more. But I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the past that we can apply to both the present as well as the future. And there's not enough, perhaps, conversation around that. So, number one, there's no need to exaggerate the past. Our past is glorious enough. There's absolutely no need to exaggerate it.
Yeah. Flying chariots are not needed.
Flying chariots are not needed. We did amazing things 4,000 years ago without the flying chariots. Two, and I think this sort of corresponds to the point that you're driving at as well, is that certainly since independence and certainly since the capital is situated in Delhi, a lot of our history tends to be land-based. And I think a lot of the victimhood that is felt is also a consequence of that land-based narrative of Indian history. Most Indian history is actually maritime, and we need to focus much more on our maritime tradition. All the way from northeast to the peninsula of Gujarat, we have a coast, and we exploited the maritime trade routes enormously. Third, as I said, we sort of got into it earlier, sort of mixing Angus Madison's numbers along with what I described, we were probably the biggest beneficiaries of trade for millennia until the British came along and applied their tariffs and so on. But we shouldn't let a 150-year period obliterate 4,000 years before that, right? We should pay attention to what we were, and we benefited enormously from this wave of globalization. But I suppose if you were to think about the past as the guide for the future, I think the way to think about it is, contrary to the sort of Western narrative, the global trade theater in the past was basically the Indian Ocean. And it is also the only ocean that is named for a country. And it was named for a country because this was the dominant force in the Indian Ocean. And if you look forward, you project forward, say, another 50 years, you'll probably see the Indian Ocean sort of not necessarily becoming the biggest, but certainly one of the primary theaters of trade, of strategy, etc., around the world. I think that is inevitable. So even today, if you look at just trade numbers, basically 35% of global trade goes through just the Straits of Malacca. Out there, 85% of China's energy goes through the Straits of Malacca. This, by the way, is what is driving the Chinese crazy. I mean, they call it the Malaccan dilemma, which is why they're building ports in Sittwe, they're building ports in Gwadar, they're building alternative routes to bring energy into China. And we are basically sleepwalking as this process goes along. So if I were to sort of think about it, I think we should pay a lot of attention to the Straits of Malacca. And out there, I think we have an asset that for some reason we fought for really hard to keep this asset, and then after that we have completely ignored. And that would be the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. So if you look at the Great Nicobar, which is the southernmost island of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, it's also got a little thing on top, Little Nicobar. So the Great Nicobar Island is basically about 1,100 square kilometers, so it's bigger than Hong Kong. As I said earlier, 35% of global trade goes within 50 kilometers of the Great Nicobar Islands. 85% of China's energy goes within 50 kilometers of the Great Nicobar Island. What are we doing with the Great Nicobar exactly? Absolutely nothing. Anytime we bring up something, and by the way, so if just to bring in the logic of economics into this, people who look into the transshipment business will know that basically India has 3 fantastic ports: Dubai, Colombo, and Singapore. Okay? The amount of transshipment, because our ports are so poor that all of our transshipment business basically goes through these 3 ports. We literally have created Colombo. If you go to the website of Colombo Port, they will the first thing they tell you is we are the gateway to India. I mean, it's astonishing. And by the way, all of this leads to an enormous fiscal drain. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars that are lost because 50% of the cargo intended for India goes through these 3 ports just to transship. And transship is basically take from one ship, put it on another ship. We can't even do this business. Okay? So I'm making a very powerful case for the Great Nicobar to actually be basically one of our centerpieces of our strategic policy going forwards, where you could have a transshipment port, a free trade zone, and actually allows you a room for experimenting with rules. So I'm probably jumping across too many topics now, but we all know that the reforms process is very hard to do. And what we can basically learn from the Chinese experience is don't do this head on. So don't try to do reforms at the national level. And even the Chinese reforms didn't start in Beijing or Shanghai. It started in a little fishing village in the Pearl River Delta. So similarly, we have assets like Shenzhen. Nicobar is an asset like Shenzhen. If we could stop thinking about preserving the 3 frogs out there and instead concentrate on the fact that this is our biggest strategic asset, I think it would be hugely important. Just to close this line of thinking, just going back to the maritime versus land-based tradition, I'll also probably argue for the fact that, so most people make this argument that India should be much more of a federation like the United States. I would actually argue that we probably need to be an even looser federation. Because ultimately, if you're a Keralite, I don't actually give a toss about Pakistan. Dubai matters to me much more than Pakistan does. Colombo matters to me much more than Pakistan does. So I would argue for an even looser federation of the states, which then allows you to experiment a lot with subnational reforms, whether at the state level or at the city level. 2 more points. One, again, if you look back into the history of trade, civilizational trade, all of that trade was basically coming out of Indian port cities. We should basically stop this nonsense about us being a village-based economy and embrace our urban future. We are urbanizing at a furious rate, and urban is primarily the engine of prosperity. Embrace it. Because that's what our forefathers did. And last, because of the audience that is sitting in here, Sanjeev and I wrote an op-ed once making a case for the new Portland in Bombay, the old Portland in Bombay, when it opens up, that the anchor tenant of that Portland, on the scale of a Sydney Opera House, be something like a museum of the maritime history of the Indian Ocean. And you can actually make this a multinational collaboration. We have spoken to people in Oman, we have spoken to people in Malaysia. Everybody would like to collaborate because a museum of this nature actually allows you to tell your own history.
Thanks, Ruben. That was excellent. Now, let me turn to the young man there and ask him what he thinks is maybe because I'm going to open out after this to Q&A if we have the time. What would you think, I've heard a lot of discussions. How do we apply this forward into policies, ideas for, a better India?
So let me start with one idea which I think a lot about and I talk about sometimes. Since everybody's so keen on, incorporating this god and this leader and that leader, how is it that we have completely, and I say this primarily also to really annoy Arundhati Roy, which I love doing, that every time she talks about Ambedkar, somebody has to mention Ambedkar, the economist, to her. Because in the entire pantheon building of Ambedkar, nobody talks about Ambedkar, the economist. Very cleverly, we have kept out Ambedkar, the economist, from the conversation.
In fact, that is what he was. He was a PhD in economics.
Exactly. Nobody wants to talk about Ambedkar's economic ideas because that is not kosher.
He had 20 scholarly published papers in monetary economics.
And if you read Ambedkar, the economist, here is a man who's classically arguing, long before Reuben Abraham, that urbanization is our future. A man consistently arguing that. A man consistently saying, Ambedkar's famous essay, completely unread these days, India Before the Crown Government, where clearly he's talking about, we talked about Angus Madison and why India became what it became. Here is a man who point by point, duty after duty, is proving how the colonial state and before that the East India Company destroyed India's trade history, destroyed India's business, destroyed India's natural impetus towards entrepreneurship. Pliny the Elder was mentioned. One of the things that Pliny the Elder spoke about and ranted about was how the Romans were giving away all the gold coins to buy fabric. But what kind of fabric is this? Fabric which is like wisps of smoke. It is so fine and so delicate that it's like wisps of smoke that the Romans cannot even believe that such fabric exists. All of this is destroyed in India, step by step, and who proved it to us? Baba Saheb Ambedkar. Somehow that, if we were to only just rediscover Ambedkar, the economist, part of our battle is won. But somehow we never want to discuss Ambedkar, the economist. We need to understand that essentially, as we have said in this panel again and again, that essentially India was, India is, and India's future is in being an entrepreneurial nation. That is who we were, that is who we are, and that is who we are going to be. That's the past, that's the present, and that's the future. And it is because for many, many decades in our country that we purposely buried, destroyed, disowned with great tolerance this entrepreneurial history of ours, that we are in this situation today. We're in a situation, you tell me, Tirupur was mentioned. What is the great education that most people doing business in Tirupur have? And how is it that year after year they do what they do? So we have destroyed every ounce of traditional entrepreneurship that was the bedrock of our country, and that is why we have come to the state that we are today. Rediscover Ambedkar, rediscover entrepreneurship.
With that, I think, I don't know how much time we have left, but I think we could definitely have a few interesting questions coming up. I can't see very much. Okay, so Anand, I can...
There's 2 questions right
Yeah.
there.
Well, first of all, thank you for a wonderful session. I guess I have a very simple question, which is that obviously that what the 3 of you were saying was music to my ears, but I suspect that it wasn't necessarily music to the ears of many people who retain a kind of deep core suspicion of the market. So my question to you is that you have the right ideas, you've read the history, you've done all of that. How do you convert 1.2 billion people to your thinking?
Can I just take 1 second and answer that? 1.2 billion people are already getting converted every day. The problem is with 5,000 people in Delhi. I do not believe 1.2 billion people are not getting converted. 1.2 billion people are seeing the magic that is happening in their lives every single day. It's the 5,000 people, out of which many are hereditary members of the Delhi Gymkhana Club. You know, like many party memberships, the membership of the Gymkhana also goes from father to son and from mother to daughter. You know, that's the tradition of Delhi. So therein lies the problem. The problem is not with 1.2 billion people.
Excellent. Unfortunately, we have time for exactly one more question. So I'm going to... Jayaji, have a question? Sorry, both of them are right in front, but anyway.
One very small fact and a quick question. I don't know, you talked so much about maritime and coins. The Bhuj Museum has fascinating hair clips and brooches which the maritime people used as coins because coins would otherwise fall out of their pockets. These are fascinating things that could go into your museum. But apart from that, I want to ask you, when globalization, as you have so clearly proved, was inclusive, was widespread, and that made India great so long ago, why is it that today the Marxists and the communists are the ones who are calling themselves progressive and liberal and inclusive, and we are not?
With great humility, I ask for your forgiveness. I am a very blunt person. I have a reputation. It is because your generation and the generation before this allowed them to say it.
It is true.
I say this with
it
great
really
humility.
is true. It's amazing how
Please forgive me for saying this. I say this with great humility, ma'am. But it's generations before mine which allowed them to claim it. You know.
I mean, the term liberal has been taken about by people who oppose liberalization of the economy. How on earth does that make any sense at all?
It's the difference between liberal with a capital L and a small l. And the liberal is actually today the small l. So the people who believe in the capital L liberal need to reclaim it. And that's a long drawn out process. I'm not claiming for a second that's easy. But you've got to fight on every front that's available to you. Education. I mean, look at the economics textbooks that are taught. It's absolute garbage. I remember the economics I learned in college. I mean, it's like post-Joan Robinson, nothing happened. It's like, are you kidding me? Rational expectation. You may disagree with it. That's totally fine. But can you pretend like rational expectations did not happen? Chicago did not happen? What on earth are you talking about?
People don't even believe that Nasadiya Sukta happened.
I think we have a question here from this. Yeah.
I teach economics at IIT Delhi. My name is Dr. Seema Sharma, economist by training. Of course, I'm very happy to see the way you have talked about in favor of capitalism and all, even though you spent little time on that. But just one thought which is there in my mind always, that of course it has merits, demerits, but I don't think we can ignore that the demerit part too much, because otherwise whom to blame for the problems we had, like the Southeast Asian crisis, then your subprime crisis, all these things. Do you think that if we just blindly follow capitalism, it is going to do good to the world?
I think when our per capita income is that of the Americans, we'll worry about their problems.
And more importantly...
But let me tell you, how can I forget about the people, the Indians at that time who committed suicide? Ultimately, policy is good, bad, capitalism, or you go for any other kind of economic system.
Can I give you one line?
Ultimately, people have to live that.
Yeah, can I give you one line?
Yeah.
Let's not think in terms of monolithic structures again. Capitalism means different things in different societies.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not like Marxism that means one thing in every society.
Yeah, that's right.
Capitalism means different things in different societies.
But what you said
so
now...
it's not necessarily true that capitalism somewhere else would be capitalism in India.
The thing is...
And more importantly, go back to paraphrasing Winston Churchill's old line.
That's right.
Capitalism is a terrible system, barring all other alternatives.
Thank you so much, because this is what you did not say earlier. And the audience...
No, I think you've misunderstood what I'm saying.
I mean, look at Gandhi's trusteeship.
Yes, that's right. And I'm happy. Thank you so much.
I think we really have to end it here. I'm sorry, but the three of us are around and love to chat outside. Thank you so much.